It all started a few weeks ago, but looking back, I realized the signs had been there for a while. At first, I didn't notice anything drastic, just small changes in Sarah. She became quieter, a little more distant, but I brushed it off as work stress. We both had intense jobs, and I assumed we were just in one of those rough patches that all couples go through. But the more I tried to engage with her, the more she seemed to withdraw. Our once lively conversations were reduced to short, tense exchanges, and before I knew it, the silence between us felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. It wasn't long before the questions began. At first, they seemed innocent enough. How was work? Or what time will you be home? But then they started to feel different, sharper. Who were you with today? Why are you home so late? I remember feeling confused, but not overly concerned. I had nothing to hide. I told her the truth. I was working late on a big project that included a few new hires, and we were all grinding to meet a deadline. But with each answer I gave, Sarah seemed to grow colder, more distant, as if my explanations only fed into her growing suspicions. The turning point came one night when I woke up to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched over, scrolling through my phone. The faint glow of the screen lit up her face, and the look in her eyes wasn't one of curiosity. It was something darker. Suspicion. Distrust. I sat up, groggy and confused. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep. She jumped, startled that I had caught her. "Just checking something," she muttered, putting the phone down quickly like she'd been burned. She slid back under the covers, but the tension in the air was undeniable. I was too tired to push it, but something gnawed at me. This wasn't the Sarah I knew. This was someone else. Someone suspicious, someone who didn't trust me. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at home became unbearable. Every time I tried to talk to Sarah, she would either avoid me or give clipped, distant answers. She stopped smiling, stopped asking about my day, unless it was to pry into where I'd been or who I'd been with. It was like living with a stranger. And still, I had no idea what was going on in her head. It wasn't until I found an open search on her laptop, something like "How to Catch a Cheating Husband," that the full picture began to form. Sarah thought I was having an affair. I didn't know what had triggered these thoughts, but it was clear she had become consumed by them. She was building a case against me, in her mind at least. Every late night, every casual text, every unaccounted for hour was, in her view, evidence of my infidelity. I tried to confront her about it one night, asking directly if she thought I was cheating. Her response shocked me. Instead of denying it or laughing it off, she just looked at me coldly and said, "Why? Do you have something to hide?" I was speechless. This was beyond stress. This was mistrust. A heavy, suffocating mistrust that had taken root in our marriage, and I didn't know how to fix it. Whatever I said or did seemed to only feed into her growing paranoia. Little did I know, Sarah had been stewing in her anger, letting her suspicions fester until they reached a boiling point. And when they did, the way she confronted me was something I could have never imagined in my worst nightmares. The night it happened started like any other. I got home late, exhausted after another grueling day at work. Sarah barely acknowledged my presence when I walked in, her eyes fixed on the TV, the tension between us thicker than ever. I grabbed a quick dinner, avoiding any attempt at conversation, and retreated to the bathroom for a long, hot shower, hoping it would wash away the stress that had been piling up both at home and at the office. When I finally made my way to bed, all I wanted was sleep. Sarah had already turned in, her back to me as I slipped under the covers. As soon as I got into bed, though, I felt it, a cold, smooth sensation against my leg. At first, I brushed it off as the blanket bunching up in a weird way, but then I felt it again, more distinct this time. It moved. My body went rigid as panic surged through me. Something was in the bed with us. My heart raced as I threw off the blankets and jumped out of bed, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. And that's when I saw it, a snake. A real, live snake, coiled up right there on the bed where I had just been lying. "What the?" I stumbled backward, staring in disbelief. "Sarah, there's a snake in our bed," I shouted, my voice cracking from a mix of fear and confusion. Sarah appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, a look on her face that sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't horrified. She was calm. Too calm. "Yeah," she said flatly. "I put it there." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What? Why would you do that?" She stepped closer, her eyes hard, her voice colder than the snake that had just slithered across my skin. "Because I know you're cheating on me." I blinked, struggling to process what I had just heard. Cheating? Snake in the bed? My mind raced, but nothing made sense. Cheating on you? Sarah, I'm not. What are you talking about? Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. Don't lie to me. I've seen the late nights, the texts, the way you've been acting. You think I'm stupid? I stood there, dumbfounded. This was beyond anything I could have imagined. Sarah, listen to yourself. A snake in the bed? This is insane. I've been working late because of that project. I'm not cheating on you. Where did you even get a snake? I was yelling now, trying to understand how we had gone from silence to full-on madness in such a short time. Her eyes were unblinking, her face hard as stone. I had to do something to get your attention, she said, her voice dropping. You've been lying to me, treating me like I don't exist, and I'm not going to sit here and let you make a fool out of me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sarah, I'm not lying to you. I've been working. That's it. You think throwing a snake in my bed is how you confront me? She didn't flinch. I thought it was fitting. You've been slithering around behind my back. Now you know what it feels like. My pulse raced, and I had no words. She stood there, glaring at me, waiting for some kind of confession. But there wasn't one. I hadn't cheated on her. I hadn't done anything wrong. And now, I was standing in my own bedroom, facing off against the woman I thought I knew, wondering if I had completely lost her. For a moment, I was too shocked to even respond. Cheating? She thought I was cheating on her? And her response to that was to put a snake in our bed? Are you out of your mind? I finally managed to say, you thought I was cheating, so you decided to do this? Her eyes were wild, filled with a mix of rage and hurt that I hadn't seen before. I've seen the way you've been acting lately, coming home late, always on your phone, laughing at your messages like I don't notice. I'm not stupid, Mark. I know you've been sneaking around. I stood there, my heart still pounding from the shock of the snake. But now it was twisting with confusion and disbelief. Sarah, I'm not cheating on you. I've been working late. You know that. I told you about the new project, the new hires. It's all work-related. Work-related? She spat, her voice trembling. Then why are you always hiding your phone? Why were you so friendly with that new girl at the office party last month? I saw the way you looked at her. I groaned in frustration, running my hands through my hair. We had a conversation. One conversation. She's a colleague. That's it. There's nothing going on. I can't believe you jumped to this conclusion. But she wasn't listening. Her mind had already been made up, and she was convinced I was lying. You're lying, she said, her voice cracking. I know what I saw, and I'm not going to let you make a fool of me. I'm not blind. I'm not naive. I stood there trying to make sense of the situation. The more I tried to reason with her, the more irrational she became. I could see the hurt in her eyes, but I didn't know how to make her understand. This wasn't just about some misunderstanding anymore. She had been letting these thoughts fester for weeks, maybe even months, and now they had exploded in the worst way possible. You're letting your imagination get the best of you, I said, my voice softer now, trying to calm her down. There's no one else, Sarah. You're my wife. I love you. Why would I risk everything for someone else? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she was too angry to let them fall. Because you're bored of me. Because I'm not enough anymore. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had no idea she felt this way, that she thought our marriage had deteriorated to the point where I'd look for something outside of it. The guilt crept in, not because I had cheated, but because I had been so focused on work, on my own stress, that I hadn't seen how deeply Sarah was hurting. I reached out, trying to take her hand, but she pulled away. I'm telling you the truth, I said, my voice breaking. I haven't done anything wrong, Sarah. I don't know how to prove it to you. She looked at me for a long moment, her anger slowly melting into something more vulnerable. Then why do I feel like I'm losing you? She whispered. It wasn't just anger that had driven her to this point. It was fear. As we argued, the snake on the bed slithered around, almost unnoticed amid the chaos. It was a symbol of the mess our relationship had become, something terrifying and unpredictable, lurking right under the surface. I don't believe you, Sarah said, tears welling up in her eyes. You've been so distant, so secretive. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know the truth. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the insanity of the situation. Sarah, there is no other woman. There's no affair. I love you. I've been working, that's it. If you don't believe me, you can check my phone, my work emails, whatever you want. I have nothing to hide. She stared at me, uncertainty flickering in her eyes for the first time. Slowly, she walked over and picked up my phone from the nightstand. She hesitated, then began scrolling through my messages, my emails, everything. Her fingers moved quickly, her expression growing more conflicted with each passing second. After a few minutes, her hands began to shake, and the anger in her face started to fade, replaced by guilt. She didn't find anything because there was nothing to find. I don't understand, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. I was so sure. I watched her collapse onto the edge of the bed, the reality of her actions starting to hit her. She had let her suspicions grow into something dark, something that pushed her to do the unthinkable. I wanted to be angry with her, to lash out, but seeing her like that, vulnerable and broken, made it hard. I've been telling you the truth, Sarah, I said, quieter now. All this time, you've been thinking the worst of me, but I've been trying to make this work. I didn't know you felt this way, that you thought I was pulling away. Why didn't you just talk to me? She covered her face with her hands, sobbing now, the weight of her paranoia crashing down on her. I don't know. I let myself believe it. Every time you were late, every time you didn't answer my calls right away, I thought the worst. And then I couldn't stop. It felt so real. I crouched down beside her, watching her unravel, unsure of what to say. This whole thing was insane. A snake in the bed because of jealousy? I was still trying to wrap my head around it, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew that this wasn't just about me. It was about her fears, about feeling like she wasn't enough, about our marriage crumbling in ways neither of us had acknowledged. You put a snake in our bed, Sarah, I finally said, my voice a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. This isn't okay. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know I've gone too far. I don't know what's wrong with me. I stood up, needing space to think. I looked at the snake on the bed, still slithering aimlessly, and then at the woman I loved who had been so consumed by her insecurities that she resorted to this. We were both scared of losing each other, scared of how far things had spiraled out of control. But now, we were facing the aftermath. Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with realization. I didn't find anything. I was so sure. I was still furious, but seeing her like that, broken, ashamed, softened the edge of my anger. I sat down next to her, careful to avoid the snake still slithering around. You didn't find anything because there was nothing to find, I said quietly. Why didn't you just talk to me? Why go to such an extreme? She wiped away a tear, shaking her head. I don't know. I felt like I was losing you, and I didn't know how to handle it. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of what had happened sinking in. Sarah had crossed a line, and even though I wasn't blameless in the way I had been distant, her reaction had been extreme. The trust between us was shattered, and I wasn't sure if we could ever fully repair it. I was paranoid, Mark, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Every time you were late, every time you smiled at a text, I felt this pit in my stomach. I let it grow until it swallowed me. But I didn't think I'd actually go this far. The room felt heavy with tension, the snake still a terrifying presence that neither of us seemed to want to acknowledge. But it was also a symbol of what had happened. Sarah's fear had slithered into our marriage, poisoning it, turning what should have been a relationship built on trust into something dangerous. I get it, I said, finally breaking the silence. Things have been hard. We've both been distant, but Sarah, this? I gestured toward the bed where the snake was still coiled. This isn't how you fix things. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. I could feel the frustration, anger, and sadness welling up in me, but it was hard to direct it toward her. We were both at fault, but her actions had taken things too far. And now, we were left with the wreckage. Do you want to save this? I asked suddenly, my voice low but steady. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. What? This? Us? Do you want to save it? She nodded frantically, but her voice cracked as she spoke. Yes, I do. But I know I've messed up. I've ruined everything. I let out a long breath. It's going to take a lot of work, Sarah. A lot of work. We can't just move past this like nothing happened. She nodded again, this time slower, the reality of the situation sinking in. I'll do anything, Mark. I'll go to therapy, I'll get help. I stood up and finally dealt with the snake, carefully guiding it into a box and setting it outside. When I came back, I looked at her, unsure of what the future held. I wasn't sure if we could fix what had been broken, but at least we were facing it now. We weren't out of the woods yet, but the first step was admitting just how lost we had become. After that night, things between Sarah and me were tense but calmer. We agreed to try couples therapy to figure out where things had gone so wrong. Sarah apologized profusely for her actions, overwhelmed with guilt for what she had done. But the snake in the bed wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symbol of the cracks in our relationship that we had both ignored for too long. The therapy sessions forced us to confront our issues head-on. The first few sessions were awkward and emotionally charged. I had never been the type to open up about my feelings, but the therapist didn't let me hide behind silence. Sarah, on the other hand, spoke openly about her fears and paranoia, laying bare the emotional roller coaster she had been on for months. "I felt like I was losing you," she confessed during one session. "Every late night, every unanswered text, it just built up. I started imagining the worst, and I spiraled. I thought if I didn't do something drastic, you'd leave, and I wouldn't even see it coming." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had thought my late nights at work and quiet withdrawal were just part of the daily grind, but for Sarah, they had been a trigger for her insecurities. She had felt alone in our marriage, isolated by my emotional distance. The snake incident, while extreme, was her breaking point, a misguided attempt to shake me awake, to force me to see how deeply she was hurting. "I didn't realize how far apart we'd grown," I admitted during another session. "I didn't think you were noticing how distant I was because I didn't want to face it myself. But throwing myself into work? That was my way of avoiding everything too." The conversations weren't easy, but they were necessary. Therapy helped us see the underlying issues, the unspoken resentment, the unaddressed fears, the lack of communication. Sarah's suspicion didn't come out of nowhere, and neither did my distance. We had been living parallel lives, each of us waiting for the other to bridge the gap without ever saying a word. In the weeks that followed, things slowly started to shift. We made an effort to spend more time together, to talk openly about what we were feeling without the usual defensiveness. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension and unresolved hurt, but the snake incident had forced us to confront our demons. Sarah and I started rebuilding, piece by piece. It was a long process, one that required both of us to be more honest than we had ever been. The trust that had been shattered wouldn't be easily repaired, but for the first time in a long while, we were working together to fix what had been broken. Still, in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if we could ever truly get back to where we were before. The snake had brought everything to the surface, but would we be able to move forward from here? Only time would tell. As time went on, things slowly started to improve between Sarah and me. We continued with couples therapy, and we made progress in rebuilding our communication and trust. But the snake incident had left a permanent scar on our relationship, one that neither of us could ignore, no matter how hard we tried. Every time I crawled into bed, I couldn't help but remember that night, the cold, slithery shock that sent my heart racing, and the look in Sarah's eyes when she stood in the doorway, convinced that her actions were justified. The memory haunted me, and though I tried to push it aside, it crept back in the quiet moments when my guard was down. Sarah, too, felt the weight of what had happened. In the weeks after the incident, she became overly cautious. She texted me more often, checked in with me constantly, and was always quick to ask how my day had gone. I could see she was trying to prove that she wasn't the same person who had put a snake in our bed, that she had changed, that she was working on her insecurities and fears. And while I appreciated the effort, part of me wondered if we'd ever fully get back what we'd lost. There were good days when it felt like we were making real progress. We went on more date nights, spent time reconnecting over shared hobbies, and laughed like we hadn't in months. But the trust was still fragile. Little things triggered old fears. If I stayed late at work or didn't answer my phone right away, Sarah would tense up, a shadow of doubt crossing her face. And even though I reassured her, a part of me couldn't shake the thought that she still didn't fully trust me. I found myself second-guessing everything. Every time I came home late or made plans without her, I wondered if I was walking on eggshells. Would she spiral again? Would she start doubting me, thinking I was hiding something? The snake had been a manifestation of her worst fears, and while we were working to address those fears, I wasn't sure if we could erase the damage they had caused. One night, after a particularly rough therapy session, Sarah broke down. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I'll ever stop being afraid that I'll lose you." Her vulnerability hit me hard. I knew she was trying, but the fear that had driven her to such an extreme action still lingered beneath the surface. And if I was being honest with myself, I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forget what had happened either. "I don't want to lose you either," I said quietly. "But we need to rebuild this together. It's going to take time, and we both have to trust that we can get through it." We sat there in silence, both of us wrestling with the uncertainty of what our future would look like. The snake incident had forced us to confront the cracks in our marriage, but now that those cracks were exposed, we were left wondering whether we could truly repair them, or if they would always be there, just beneath the surface, waiting to reappear. The incident had left a lasting impact on our relationship, one that wouldn't be easily shaken. But for now, we were still holding on, trying to navigate the mess that had been laid bare in front of us. Only time would tell if we could come out of this stronger, or if the damage was too deep to heal. As Sarah and I continued therapy, we made progress, though it came in small, incremental steps. The snake incident had exposed deep fractures in our relationship, wounds we hadn't even realized were festering for so long. And while therapy helped us talk about those cracks, it was clear that healing them would take time, patience, and an immense amount of trust. One evening, after yet another long and exhausting session, Sarah and I sat down in the living room, the dim light from the lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. We hadn't spoken much on the drive home, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But I knew we needed to have an honest conversation about what our future looked like. "Do you think we can really fix this?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice fragile. She was curled up on the couch, her eyes filled with uncertainty. It was the same question I'd been asking myself for weeks. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice low but steady. "I want to believe we can. I think we're both trying, but it's hard to ignore what happened." She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I still can't believe I went that far. I let my insecurities get the best of me. You didn't deserve that." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I get why you did it, even if I don't understand it fully. But we need to find a way to get back to a place where we can trust each other again." I paused, then added, "It's going to take more than just showing up for therapy sessions, though. We need to make a real effort. Both of us." Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded. "I know. And I don't want us to end like this. I love you, Mark. I don't want my fear to destroy what we've built." Hearing her say that, so raw, so vulnerable, made me realize that she wasn't just battling with her trust in me. She was fighting her own inner demons, insecurities that had been festering long before the snake incident. And while it didn't excuse what she had done, it made me see her in a new light. "I love you too, Sarah," I said, my voice soft. "But we have to be real with each other. No more hiding things, no more letting stuff fester until it blows up like this again." She nodded earnestly, and we both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything we'd gone through settling over us. We spent the next few weeks focused on rebuilding the small things, the day-to-day moments of trust. Sarah started being more open with her feelings instead of bottling them up. I made an effort to be more present, to show her that I wasn't pulling away. We worked on communicating better, setting boundaries, and being honest about our fears and anxieties. But the road was still bumpy. There were moments when the tension would creep back in, when old doubts resurfaced. If I was late coming home, I could see the worry flash across Sarah's face, even though she tried to hide it. And every now and then, I caught myself wondering if things would ever go back to the way they were before the snake incident. But then, there were the good days. Days when we laughed like we used to, when it felt like we were finding our way back to each other. Those moments gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, we could get through this. The snake in the bed had been a turning point, one that neither of us could ignore. It was a reminder of the dangers of unchecked emotions and assumptions, of what happens when communication breaks down and mistrust takes over. But it was also a wake-up call for both of us, a chance to rebuild and to make our relationship stronger than it had ever been. We knew we still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, it felt like we were both heading in the same direction. And that, at least, was a step forward. Months passed, and slowly but surely, we found ourselves in a much better place. The tension that had once filled every room we shared had eased, and our communication, something we had neglected for so long, became our strongest asset. Therapy had taught us how to open up without fear of judgment, how to voice concerns before they became suspicions, and how to listen to each other in a way we never had before. The memory of that night, with the snake in the bed, still haunted me from time to time. It wasn't something either of us could ever completely forget, but it no longer defined us. It became a symbol of a dark moment that we had managed to rise above, a reminder of how fragile trust can be, but also how resilient we had become. We decided that part of healing meant creating new memories in a new space, so we moved to a new house. It wasn't far, but it felt like a fresh start, away from the shadows of that chaotic night. The house we chose had a warmth to it, a blank slate for us to build something new, something healthier. I'll admit, there was a certain satisfaction in leaving behind the bed that had once held a symbol of Sarah's misplaced fear. Now, our new home felt like a refuge, not a battleground. Sarah was different too. The guilt that had weighed on her seemed to lift the more we talked openly about what had happened. She stopped blaming herself as harshly and focused on making our relationship better, more honest. And while I couldn't say I had completely forgotten the pain of her actions, I had come to forgive her. After all, we had both contributed to the mess we were in. We learned that love wasn't just about passion. It was about patience, understanding, and the willingness to fight for what we had built. Of course, things weren't perfect. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when old habits tried to resurface. But we had learned to face those moments head-on, without letting suspicion or fear spiral out of control. Instead of letting things fester, we talked them out, bringing them into the open before they could take root. In a way, the snake had been a turning point. It forced us to look at ourselves and our marriage with brutal honesty. We had reached a breaking point that could have ended everything, but instead, it became the catalyst for change. As I stood in our new bedroom one evening, watching Sarah laugh as she unpacked boxes, I realized just how far we had come. We weren't the same couple we had been before. We had weathered a storm that could have destroyed us, and somehow, through the pain, we had come out stronger. The snake was long gone, but the lessons it left behind stayed with us. We no longer lived in fear of what the other was thinking or doing. We had learned the hard way that assumptions can destroy a relationship if you let them. But more importantly, we had learned that with enough love, honesty, and effort, even the most broken trust can be rebuilt. This was our new beginning, and though the road had been rocky, we had found our way back to each other. And this time, we weren't letting go. In the end, the snake in the bed wasn't just a bizarre, terrifying moment in our marriage. It became a symbol of the consequences of what can happen when communication breaks down, when trust is eroded, and when fear takes control of rational thought. Sarah and I spent many nights after the incident talking about where things had gone wrong. We realized that it wasn't just the act of putting a snake in the bed or my emotional distance that had led us to that moment. It was a slow unraveling that had been happening for months, maybe even years. We had allowed our insecurities to fester in silence, letting small things turn into big suspicions, and ignoring the early signs of our disconnect. I won't lie, it took time for us to get to a place where we could trust each other again. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight, especially after something as dramatic as that night. It took therapy, patience, and a lot of honesty. It meant facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our relationship. But more than anything, it meant learning how to communicate in a way we never had before. We stopped assuming things. If something felt off, we talked about it. If one of us had a concern, we voiced it without fear of judgment. Instead of letting insecurities linger and turn into resentments, we addressed them head-on. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the old doubts resurfaced. But we had built a foundation of openness that kept us grounded. One night, after we had moved into the new house and settled into our new routine, Sarah turned to me and said, "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for that night." I looked at her, understanding the weight of those words. "You don't have to keep punishing yourself," I said gently. "We've both made mistakes, but we're still here. We're still fighting for us, and that's what matters." She smiled, a soft, grateful smile, and I knew we had turned a corner. We weren't perfect, but perfection had never been the goal. What mattered was that we were committed to growing together, to working through the hard times instead of letting them tear us apart. The snake in the bed had been a wake-up call, but it wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where we were stronger, wiser, and more aware of the power of trust and communication. We learned the hard way that assumptions can be dangerous, and unchecked emotions even more so. But we also learned that with enough effort, even the most fractured relationships can be mended. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but we had found our way through the darkness. We're not perfect, but we're trying. And in the end, that's what matters most.